I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My parents had been buried less than 48 hours earlier, the flowers on their graves still holding their color, and my older sister was already sitting across from a family lawyer dividing up a life that none of us had been given time to grieve. I stood in the doorway of my parents' house, the house I had grown up in, the house where I had learned to read and laugh and argue and love, and I watched it disappear from my life in real time, account by account, asset by asset, line by line. The shocking truth of who my sister really was had been hidden behind family dinners and birthday calls for years. But betrayal, when it finally moves, doesn't announce itself. She handed me a deed to a deteriorating farm in California's Central Valley and said, "I will never forget this. Take this shabby house. I don't need it anyway." Like she was giving me leftovers. Like she was doing me a favor. The humiliation of that moment was the deepest I have ever felt, not because of the money, not even because of the injustice, but because of what the gesture said about how little she had ever actually seen me. And tucked into the same envelope, as if she'd packaged up every inconvenient truth in one manila folder, was the information that our grandmother, frail, elderly, and dangerously neglected, was living on that property and was now my responsibility. She had given me the land nobody wanted and the woman nobody was visiting. 2 lives she had decided were worth nothing. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, because she had never had the patience to look past what something appeared to be on the surface, was what that land was capable of. What I was capable of. She had lied to herself about both of us for our entire lives, and that lie was about to cost her everything she thought she'd secured. The arrogance of her assumptions, about the land, about our grandmother, about me, was already writing the ending of a story she thought she'd already won. I was cheated out of what was rightfully mine on the worst day of my life. And 5 years later, my sister came back. What she found when she arrived at that gate, what was waiting for her on the other side of the boundary she'd drawn, is a story about karma, dignity, and what it truly means to reclaim the life someone tried to take from you. Stay with me, because what happened next will stay with you. I couldn't believe I was standing in that cemetery, still smelling the flowers they'd laid over my parents' graves, when my older sister Claire pulled me aside with that look. The kind that's not grief, it's calculation. My name is Alice. I was 24 years old. I had just buried both of my parents in the same brutal week, and the ground hadn't even settled yet. I'd barely had a chance to cry, to breathe, to let it hit me that they were actually gone. But Claire wasn't crying. She was moving. She had already called the family attorney before we'd even left the church parking lot in Portland, Oregon, and I didn't know it yet. By the time we got back to the house, our parents' house, the beautiful brick estate on the hill, the lawyer, Mr. Aldridge, was already seated at the dining room table like he'd been invited to a business meeting, not a mourning. Claire had always been the organized one in the family, the daughter who handled schedules, spoke first in difficult rooms, and made decisiveness look like virtue. Now I understood why. She sat across from Mr. Aldridge, and they spoke in low, fast voices while I stood in the doorway still wearing my black dress, still holding my mother's handkerchief. I thought I was watching something I didn't understand. I was wrong. This was betrayal dressed up as paperwork. Within 40 minutes, Claire and Mr. Aldridge had done what they had clearly planned to do before I even understood what was happening. She was already listed as successor trustee on most of my parents' assets, a position she had quietly arranged years before. And with a stack of prepared documents and my silence mistaken for consent, she moved fast enough to make grief feel like a legal disadvantage. The brick estate in Portland, the investment portfolio, the car, the jewelry collection my mother had kept locked in the mahogany box since before I was born. All of it transferred before I could form a question. I felt something happen to me in that room that I still struggle to describe. It wasn't just shock. It was like watching someone erase you. The attorney slid a manila envelope across the table in my direction without making eye contact. Claire didn't say, "I'm sorry," or "We'll figure this out together." She said, and I remember every single word. There's a property in the Central Valley of California. Dad always kept it. You're getting that. She said it the way someone says, "Take this, I don't need it." Like it was charity. Like I should be grateful she hadn't left me with nothing at all. The humiliation burned slow and deep, the kind that doesn't make you cry right away. It makes you go very, very quiet. I opened the envelope in my car, alone, parked on the street outside the house that used to be mine too. Inside was the deed to a farm, a deteriorating piece of land in the San Joaquin Valley that had been sitting mostly unused for over a decade. There was no market value listed because there wasn't much value to list. I sat with that paper in my hands for a long time, not understanding yet that what Claire thought was punishment was actually the beginning of something she'd never see coming. I didn't know that then. All I knew that evening was that I had been backstabbed at the worst moment of my life by the one person I had assumed would never do it. But what I found when I actually got to that property, I wasn't prepared for it at all. Claire made it clear, without saying it directly, that the farm in California's Central Valley was the family's discard. The thing nobody wanted, the thing you hand to the person you don't actually care about. She even smiled when she said it, just slightly, the kind of smile that knows exactly what it's doing. The farm had been in our family for decades, but it hadn't been worked, hadn't been cared for, and from what anyone could tell, hadn't been loved in a very long time. Claire had already done her research. She knew the land had no immediate liquidity. She knew I had no savings of my own. But here's the part that shocked me more than the deed, more than anything else I'd already swallowed that day. Tucked into the same envelope was a note from Mr. Aldridge's office explaining that our grandmother, Rosie, still resided on the California property, and that as the new holder of the deed, responsibility for the property's occupancy and upkeep now fell to me. Claire had done it so cleanly, so efficiently. She'd gotten rid of the land nobody wanted and the grandmother nobody was visiting, all in one move. Rosie lived there. That was the structure, and now it was mine to deal with. I felt shamed in a way I didn't have words for. The family drama I had always sensed but never confronted was out in the open now, raw and ugly. Rosie wasn't just old. She had been neglected, quietly, for years. Nobody had talked about it at the family dinners. Nobody had made it the topic of a serious conversation. Grandma Rosie was just there, on the far edge of everyone's attention, getting smaller and quieter every year, while the rest of the family stayed busy with their own lives. And now she'd been handed to me the same way you hand someone a problem you're tired of carrying. No love in the gesture, no dignity. I remember sitting in my car outside a gas station somewhere in the Central Valley, GPS pointing me toward an address I'd never visited, trying to process the layers of what had just happened to me. I had lost my parents. I had been cheated out of my rightful inheritance. I had been lied to about what the family estate even was. I had been given a dying farm and an elderly woman as though both were burdens rather than responsibilities. The truth of who my sister really was had never been clearer, and I had never felt more alone in my life, or more determined. The word worthless kept turning over in my mind. That's how Claire saw the land. That's how she saw Rosie. And if I'm being honest, I think that's how she saw me too. Someone who could be handed the scraps and would quietly disappear. The karma of that assumption would take years to arrive, but it was already set in motion. Because I didn't disappear, I kept driving. And when I finally turned off that long, dusty road and saw the farmhouse for the first time, something in me shifted, though not in the way I expected. What I found when I stepped out of that car was worse than I'd imagined. And somehow, it was the exact thing I needed to see. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not just dust and dry earth, but something heavier, like abandonment had its own scent, and the whole property was soaked in it. The farmhouse was still standing, barely, with a porch that sagged in the middle and windows so grimy you couldn't see through them. One side of the roof had a visible dip where water damage had warped the wood over years of being ignored. I stood in the driveway with my single suitcase and I thought, this is what my family thinks of me. Not a thought. A feeling that went all the way down to the floor of my chest. I found Rosie in a back room, sitting in an old rocking chair next to a window that no longer sealed properly against the cold. She was thin in a way that alarmed me. Not the thinness of age, but the thinness of someone who hadn't been eating enough, who hadn't been checked on, who had been surviving on routine and memory alone. She looked at me when I walked in, and I couldn't tell at first if she recognized me. It had been years. I was ashamed of that too, not of her, but of all of us, of the family I came from. The humiliation of that moment wasn't about the house. It was about what we had allowed to happen to her. The kitchen had some canned food, a broken stove burner, and a refrigerator that was running but barely cold. The bathroom had issues I won't go into detail about. The bedroom Claire had apparently been using as some kind of storage space on the rare visits she claimed to make was packed with boxes of things that clearly hadn't been opened in years. There was no warmth in the house, not emotional warmth, not physical warmth. The heating unit had been broken long enough that Rosie had been layering blankets through the cold nights alone. I felt something in me ignite. Not rage, exactly. Something colder and more focused than rage. The land itself was overgrown in some places, cracked and dry in others. The old irrigation pipes that ran through the property had partially collapsed. The storage shed had a broken lock and tools so rusted they were barely usable. Whatever this farm had once been, and I would later learn it had been something real, something alive, it had been left to deteriorate so completely that the evidence of its former potential was almost invisible. This was not an accident. A family tragedy had unfolded here slowly, on a piece of land nobody bothered to care for, while Rosie watched it fall apart from her chair. I didn't cry. I wanted to, but I didn't. I sat on the edge of Rosie's bed that night, made her a simple meal from what I could find, covered her properly, and just sat with her in the quiet. She held my hand at some point, and I realized this woman had been waiting. For someone. For anyone. For family. The shocking truth was that the most valuable thing I'd inherited wasn't the broken land. It was her. And whatever came next, I was not going to let this woman feel forgotten again. I just didn't know yet how far that promise would take me. I gave myself one night to sit in the feeling, just one, because I knew if I let it go longer, it would become a permanent resident. The grief of losing my parents, the betrayal of my sister, the injustice of what had been done to both me and Rosie. I let it all be real for those hours. I cried quietly in the dark while Rosie slept down the hall. And then, morning came, and I made a decision that changed everything. I decided that I was not going to become the person Claire expected me to become. I was not going to call her begging. I was not going to become a victim of the family drama she had orchestrated so precisely. I was going to survive, and then some. The first week was humbling in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had grown up in a household where things were maintained by other people, and suddenly I was crawling under sinks, watching YouTube tutorials on pipe repairs, patching window seals with materials from a hardware store I drove 40 minutes to reach. My hands blistered. My back hurt in ways it had never hurt before. There were moments I sat on the floor of that farmhouse kitchen and genuinely laughed at the absurdity of my situation. Not because it was funny, but because the alternative was to crumble. I chose to laugh. I chose to keep moving. What surprised me was Rosie. As the house slowly became livable, warmer, cleaner, more like a place a human being should be, she started coming back to life in ways I hadn't expected. She began sitting with me in the mornings instead of staying in her room. She started commenting on things, little observations, small jokes, old memories she'd share without warning while I was fixing something. The woman who had seemed nearly lost when I arrived was still in there, sharp and full and real. She had a way of saying very little and noticing everything. By that first winter, I had already learned that if Rosie made a prediction about people, it usually arrived right on time. I kept my spending minimal, my energy focused, and my emotions disciplined. I wasn't going to waste what little I had on mourning what was stolen. Every dollar I didn't spend on something unnecessary was a dollar I could put toward the property. Every hour I wasn't sleeping, I was learning about the land, about agriculture, about what had once grown here and what could grow here again. I didn't have a plan yet, not a real one, but I had a direction, and in those early weeks, direction was everything. It was the only thing standing between me and the despair that was constantly, quietly knocking. I remember the first evening I sat on the porch after a full day of hard physical work, watching the sun go down over the dry fields, and feeling something I hadn't felt since before my parents died. A faint, stubborn flicker of possibility. Not happiness, not confidence, not certainty. Just the quiet sense that this broken piece of land might not be the ending my sister intended it to be. I didn't know yet what it would become, but I was starting to feel that it could become something, and that feeling, small as it was more dangerous to Claire than she would ever imagine. I started reading everything I could find about the San Joaquin Valley, about the soil composition of the region, about what crops had historically thrived in California's Central Valley and which ones were gaining traction in the organic market. I read in the evenings after Rosie went to sleep, borrowing books from the county library, watching videos on an old laptop I'd had since college. What I found surprised me. This land my sister had thrown at me like a used tissue, was sitting on genuinely fertile ground. The soil wasn't dead. It was dormant. There's a difference. Dead things don't come back. Dormant things are just waiting. The irrigation system was the first serious challenge. Most of the pipes were old galvanized steel, partially collapsed, inefficient even when they'd been working. I found a local agricultural supply shop and spent time talking to the owner, a quiet man named Dale, who had worked in Central Valley farming for 30 years. He showed me how to source recycled drip irrigation tubing at a fraction of the cost of new materials. He talked to me for almost 2 hours without charging me anything, and I think he could see what I was trying to do. A young woman alone on a failing property, asking the right questions. He gave me a price cut on my first purchase. Small kindnesses matter more than people know. Rosie was my most unexpected resource. As the farm started to transform, even slightly, even slowly, she became more engaged, more present, more like the woman she must have been decades ago. She began telling me things about the land I couldn't have found in any book, where the old water table ran, what grew best in which section of the property, how her husband had managed the early harvests when the farm had been alive. She knew the land the way you only know something you've loved, and she passed that knowledge to me with a kind of urgency, like she'd been holding it in storage waiting for someone worthy to give it to. We planted the first vegetables together, Rosie directing from a lawn chair I'd set up beside the cleared row, me on my knees in the dirt working the seeds in by hand. Tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, leafy greens, and several heritage varieties Rosie remembered from her early farming years that I hadn't even been able to find in most stores. There was something sacred about that afternoon. 2 women, one very young, one very old, both treated as disposable by the same family, putting living things into the earth and refusing to accept the narrative that had been written for them. This was reclaiming, not just land, not just dignity. Everything. The weeks that followed were hard in ways I can't fully capture in words. Heat, physical exhaustion, setbacks, a crop loss that cost me more than I could afford. A week where Rosie had a health scare that terrified me and reminded me how fragile everything was. But we stayed. We kept going. And slowly, the field started to look like something. By the end of that first summer, green rows stretched out where there had been nothing but cracked earth and dry weeds. I'd stand at the edge of the property in the early morning and just look at it. feeling something that I can only describe as defiance made visible. What was growing out there wasn't just produce. It was proof. The farmers' market in the nearest town ran every Saturday morning and had about 40 vendors when I first showed up with my modest harvest in the back of a borrowed pickup truck. I set up my table with handwritten signs and whatever produce I'd managed to get to market quality. And I stood behind it with the specific kind of nerves that come not from fear of embarrassment, but from fear that your best effort still won't be enough. My stomach was tight all morning. I needed this. Not just for the money, though the money was desperately necessary, but for confirmation that what I was building was real and not just a story I was telling myself to survive. By mid-morning, I'd made some sales. Decent ones, actually. But what changed everything was when a man stopped at my table and picked up one of the heirloom tomatoes Rosie had suggested I plant. He turned it in his hands slowly, smelled it, and set it down like someone who knows exactly what they're evaluating. His name was Nolan. He owned 2 farm-to-table restaurants in the region, and he was always at the market looking for suppliers worth his attention. He asked me where the farm was, how I was irrigating, what else I was growing. He asked thoughtful questions that told me he wasn't just making conversation. He was assessing. We talked for almost 30 minutes at that table while the market moved around us. I told him about the land, about the recycled irrigation, about the heritage varieties Rosie had introduced me to. I didn't tell him about the inheritance, about the betrayal, about any of the family drama that had led me to that field. I talked about the product. He listened carefully, and then he said something that I've never forgotten. This is the kind of quality that most people stop chasing. I'm glad you didn't. And he held out his hand. We shook on a regular supply agreement right there between the tomato tables and the honey vendor. It was the first moment I truly believed I was going to be okay. I drove home from that market with cash in my pocket, a handshake deal with a serious buyer, and something I hadn't had in months, momentum. I told Rosie about Nolan the moment I walked through the door, and she clapped her hands once and said, "Now we're farming." Not you're farming, we're farming. That detail hit me harder than I expected. This woman who had been abandoned on a deteriorating property, left to grow weak and invisible, was now claiming ownership in something growing and alive. The karmic weight of that moment. I felt it then even though I didn't have the words for it yet. The agreement with Nolan wasn't just a financial turning point. It was confirmation that the direction I'd chosen was real, that the instincts I'd been trusting through those lonely, exhausting months were not self-deception. With that validation came something new. Not just hope, but ambition. I started seeing the farm differently, not as something to save, as something to build, as something that could, with time and discipline and the right choices, become far more than my sister had ever allowed herself to imagine it could be. The question now wasn't whether I would survive. The question was how high this would go. The first year was survival. The second year was strategy. By the third year, the farm had a name, Rosie Ridge Organics, and it was on the menu of 4 restaurants in the region, 2 of which had won local awards for their seasonal produce sourcing. I had hired 2 part-time workers, both local women who needed steady income and who quickly became as committed to the land as I was. We expanded the crop variety, added a small herb garden that became surprisingly profitable, and started drying and packaging some of the heritage products under the farm's brand for the specialty food market. The thing my sister had handed me like garbage had started generating real revenue. Real, meaningful, documented revenue. Rosie's transformation during this period was one of the most quietly profound things I have ever witnessed. The woman who had been slumped in a rocking chair, thin and nearly invisible, was now in the fields with us on good weather mornings, advising, correcting, teaching. We'd fixed her room properly, real warmth, a good mattress, fresh curtains she'd chosen herself from a catalog she studied with total seriousness. She was eating well, sleeping well, and had started writing down recipes in a notebook she kept on the kitchen table. Her mind was sharp. Her opinions were fierce. She was alive in a way she hadn't been in years, and it was directly connected to being seen, being needed, and being treated with the dignity she had always deserved. I modernized the irrigation system completely by year 3, graduating from our early patchwork repairs to a proper drip system mapped to soil moisture sensors. We added a small cold storage facility, a wash and pack station, and a simple greenhouse for year-round growing of high-value crops. Every reinvestment I made in the property increased its value and its yield capacity. I wasn't just farming. I was building infrastructure. I was building something that could compound. And the deeper I got into the work, the more clearly I saw that what my sister had given me out of contempt was, in structural terms, a gift she'd never had the intelligence to recognize. Rosie Ridge Organics became known in our region for consistency, quality, and the story behind it, though we never marketed the family betrayal aspect directly. We let the product speak. Nolan became a genuine partner in the business, not just a buyer, and his endorsement opened doors that would have taken years to find on my own. By year 4, we had our first wholesale distribution deal with a natural foods chain, and I remember signing that contract at the kitchen table where I'd first sat with Rosie eating canned soup, trying to figure out how to fix a stove. The contrast wasn't lost on me. It felt like justice, quiet and earned. The farm now employed 6 people full-time and 4 part-time. Revenue was in the mid-6 figures and growing. What had begun as an act of survival had become an act of legacy. I stopped trying to make my parents noble in places where they had simply failed. Whatever they had intended, the truth was that Claire had used their death to take what she wanted. The farm became my life, not because they protected me, but because I refused to let what was left be wasted too. What was coming next, though, was something none of us could have scripted. By the end of year 4, I knew I had something worth protecting. Not just financially, though the numbers were serious now and growing, but in terms of what it represented. Years of sacrifice, Rosie's legacy, the labor of the women I employed, the story of a piece of land that everyone had dismissed, and that had refused to stay dismissed. I had built something real, and the last thing I was going to allow was for that something to be vulnerable to the same kind of legal maneuver that had been used to strip me in my parents' attorney's office years before. I was not going to be caught unprepared again. Not by anyone. Especially not by family. A colleague of Nolan's referred me to Marcus Webb, an agricultural and estate attorney based in Sacramento, who had spent his career helping farm operations protect their assets through trust structures. I drove to that meeting alone, in a vehicle I owned outright, wearing clothes I'd bought with money I'd earned, and I sat across from Marcus with documentation, financial records, property assessments, growth projections, and a clear question: how do I make sure no one can ever take this from me? He looked at the paperwork, looked at me, and said, "Let's build a wall around it." I liked him immediately. Marcus structured the land, business assets, brand, and equipment inside an irrevocable trust, with me as managing trustee, and Rosie protected as lifetime beneficiary and legacy steward of the property. Any legal challenge to the ownership or distribution of the assets would face a structure specifically designed to withstand the kind of family-based claim my sister might someday attempt. He explained every page of that trust to both of us at the kitchen table, and Rosie listened with the alert stillness of someone filing away every protection we were building. Marcus was thorough, precise, and left no door open. "Self-worth," he told me once, "starts with protecting what you built." I wrote that down. I remember the afternoon the paperwork was finalized and filed. I drove back to the farm, parked in the driveway, and sat for a moment looking at the fields, green and structured and alive, so different from the cracked, dry disaster I'd arrived 2 years before. This land was safe now, not because I was powerful or connected or lucky, because I had worked for it, planned for it, and refused to leave anything to assumption. The dignity of that moment, of having gone from holding a worthless deed in a parking lot to holding a protected trust document for a genuine agricultural enterprise. That was a feeling I will carry for the rest of my life. Rosie asked me that evening what I had done in Sacramento. I told her I had built a wall around everything we'd built together. She nodded slowly and said, "Good, because they'll come back." I asked her who she meant. She just looked at me with the kind of knowing that comes from a long life watching people, and she didn't say anything else. At the time, I thought she was just being cautious, but Rosie had always been the sharpest person in any room she was in. And as the 5th year of my life on that farm approached, I would remember that quiet warning with a chill that ran all the way down my spine. I didn't track my sister's life deliberately. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't spending my evenings searching her name or keeping mental spreadsheets of her failures. I had too much actual work to do, too many things worth my attention, too much life being built on this farm to spend it monitoring someone who had tried to erase me. But news travels, even when you don't chase it. And over the years, enough fragments made their way to me through old family contacts that I could construct a picture of what was happening to Claire in Portland. And the picture was not what she had expected when she walked out of that attorney's office 5 years earlier with everything. The brick estate had been mortgaged, not once, twice. Claire had taken equity out of the property to fund a lifestyle that, from the outside, looked like success, and, from the inside, was running on fumes. The investment portfolio had been partially liquidated within the first 2 years. The bank accounts, the ones she'd swept before I could even ask a question, had been spent down through a combination of renovations, travel, and the compulsive habits of someone who confused access to wealth with the ability to manage it. The betrayal embedded in every one of those choices was not directed at me anymore. It was directed at herself. And it was working. By year 3 after the funeral, Claire was behind on her mortgage. By year 4, she had reportedly tried and failed to sell the Portland estate at a price that would cover what she owed, because the market had shifted and the equity she'd borrowed against had left little margin. The property she had claimed so decisively, taken with a confidence that bordered on performance, was slowly being swallowed by the debt she'd built on top of it. Karma doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it comes in the form of compounding interest and overdrawn accounts. I heard about the bankruptcy filing through someone who had been at the reading of the will. Not as gossip, they told me because they thought I should know, because they had watched what happened in that attorney's office and had carried the guilt of their own silence ever since. When they told me, I didn't feel the rush of satisfaction I might have expected. What I felt was something more complicated, a kind of sad clarity, the confirmation of what I had suspected about my sister's character all along. She had never been building anything. She had been consuming, and you can only consume so long before there's nothing left. The same woman who had handed me a broken farm like it was charity was now, apparently, looking for options. That detail reached me too. That Claire was exploring ways to access capital, that she'd been asking around about property values in the Central Valley, that her fiancé Grady had reportedly done some research of his own. I won't pretend I didn't feel a low, focused alertness when I heard that. I didn't panic. I didn't reach out. I let Marcus know to make sure our documentation was current and accessible. And I waited. Because Rosie had told me they'd come back. 5 years after Claire handed me that deed, I was beginning to believe she was right. I was in the East Field with 2 of my workers, walking a row inspection on the heritage pepper crop, when one of the staff from the main house radioed that 2 visitors had arrived at the gate and were asking for me by name. They gave the names. I stood very still in the middle of that row for a moment, the radio in my hand, the sun overhead, and I felt the full weight of 5 years land on my shoulders in a single breath. Claire and Grady, here, in the Central Valley, at the gate of my farm, the farm she had handed to me like an insult. I took a long breath, handed the inspection clipboard to my worker, and said, "Let them in." I wanted to see their faces when they drove up the main road. I positioned myself deliberately, not in the farmhouse, not hiding, but standing in the open driveway near the main operations building, where you could see the full scope of the property. The organized fields, the cold storage facility, the wash and pack station, the signage, the workers moving through the rows, the general atmosphere of a functioning and serious agricultural enterprise. I wanted them to arrive and understand, before a single word was said, that this was not what they had left. This was not what they had discarded. This was something they could not have imagined. The car that came up the road was a rental, a detail I noticed immediately because Claire had always driven a specific imported SUV, the same one she'd had at the funeral, and this wasn't it. Grady was driving. Claire was in the passenger seat, and even through the windshield I could read the shock on her face as the car moved slowly through the property toward where I was standing. They pulled up and got out, and for a moment neither of them said anything. They just looked. At the fields, at the building, at me, at the woman who was supposed to have quietly failed somewhere out here in the California heat. Claire looked older, not dramatically. 5 years isn't dramatic. But there was a tiredness in her that hadn't been there before. Some of the precision in how she presented herself, the careful construction of image that had always been her armor, had softened in ways she probably wasn't aware of. Grady looked uncomfortable, the way men look when they're in a place they didn't expect and don't control. I stood there and let the silence do its work. I didn't rush to fill it. I didn't perform warmth. I waited. Because I had learned, in 5 years of farming and building and protecting this land, that the person who speaks first in a silence like that is always the one who needs something. Claire spoke first. She said my name. She said it like she was trying on a feeling, testing whether it would land. I didn't say anything. I just waited. And in the space between her saying my name and me responding, I could see the full shape of what was coming. Not because I'm psychic, not because I had inside information, but because I had been studied by this woman my whole life, and I knew exactly what she looked like when she needed something and was pretending she didn't. I had been backstabbed by her in her strongest moment. I was not going to be caught off guard in her weakest one. What she was about to say, what was already forming behind her eyes, would confirm everything. And I was ready. Claire started with the weather. I want you to understand how deliberate that is. When someone with her level of social intelligence leads with small talk, it's not because they're nervous. It's because they're building an approach. She commented on how beautiful the Central Valley looked this time of year, how she'd forgotten how vast the sky was out here, how it reminded her of the stories our grandmother used to tell. She said it softly, warmly, with a kind of nostalgic ache in her voice that was so perfectly calibrated I almost wanted to applaud. Almost. This was family betrayal dressed in careful language, and I had spent 5 years becoming someone who could see straight through it. She talked about blood. That's the next move in that particular playbook. When you need something from someone you've wronged, you invoke the thing that can't be logically argued against. We're family, Alice. We're all we have now. Mom and Dad are gone and we have to hold on to what's left. She said variations of that for a while, and Grady stood nearby with his hands in his pockets looking at the ground, which told me he was either ashamed or bored, and I hadn't yet decided which. I listened to Claire speak about blood ties and shared memories and the pain of losing our parents, and I listened carefully, because embedded in everything she was saying was the performance, the scaffolding she was building toward the actual request. What she didn't expect was that I wasn't responding the way I was supposed to. In her version of this reunion, I was supposed to be softened by the language of family. I was supposed to feel the pull of those shared memories, to feel guilty for my own success in the face of her apparent hardship, to want to restore something between us because that's what good people do. They forgive, they reconnect, they extend the hand. But I wasn't performing goodness for her benefit anymore. I had done the actual work of goodness, caring for Rosie, rebuilding the land, building a dignified life, and I didn't need her approval to know it was real. I invited them inside for water. Not coffee, not a meal, water. A small signal, but precise. I watched Claire register it. Inside the farmhouse, she looked around at what I had done to the space. The renovations, the warmth, the photographs on the walls, the evidence of a real home lived in by people who loved each other. And something moved across her face that she covered quickly. I thought it might be regret. I think now it was reassessment, recalculating how to approach me based on data that didn't match her predictions. The arrogance of her assumptions about who I was and what I was capable of was becoming visible to her in real time. We sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen where I had once eaten canned soup with Rosie while trying to figure out how to survive. And Claire looked at me across it with her hands folded and said, "I've missed you." I looked back at her and said nothing. Not to be cruel, because I didn't believe her. And I had learned, slowly and at real personal cost, that responding to things I don't believe only creates confusion about where I stand. The truth is that I didn't miss her. I had grieved her years ago, grieved the version of a sister I had wanted her to be, and had finally accepted she never was. What was sitting across from me at my table was not family. It was a negotiation, and the papers were coming. Grady was the one who put the folder on the table. That detail matters, that Claire let him do it, that she created a small buffer of distance between herself and the action. Grady slid a document folder across the wooden surface toward me without making eye contact, and Claire said in a voice that was still trying to carry warmth, "We just want to talk through some options." Options. I looked at the folder and then back at her and said, "Go ahead." She nodded at Grady, and he opened the folder, and there it was. A legal document proposing that I sell 50% of the farm, 50% of what I had built, what Rosie and I had rebuilt together, what I had protected, what I had bled for, to address Claire's financial obligations. She framed it as partnership. She used phrases like shared legacy and what our family built and making it right for both of us. She said the farm had originally belonged to our parents and that both of us had a moral and arguably legal connection to it. She said Grady had done some research. She actually said that Grady did some research, and that a 50-50 split of the current assessed value would resolve her immediate financial situation while still leaving me with a significant asset. It was presented calmly, confidently, the way people present things when they believe the other person has no real choice but to comply. You cheated me at the worst moment of my life, I thought, watching her across the table. You shamed me in front of a lawyer who couldn't even look me in the eye. You handed me a broken piece of land and a sick old woman and drove back to Portland without looking back. And now you are sitting in my kitchen, in my home, in the center of what I built with my hands, and you are telling me, with a straight face, that you have a claim on it. The audacity of that was almost admirable. Almost. I picked up the document. I read the first 2 pages slowly, carefully, while nobody said anything. Grady had stopped trying to make eye contact. Claire was watching me with an expression she was working to keep neutral. The legal language was aggressive, more aggressive than the soft framing she'd used in conversation. Whoever had drafted it had leaned into the language of shared estate and original family property, clearly hoping to leverage the emotional weight of inheritance against the legal reality of what I actually owned. It was clever. It was the kind of document that gets filed when the person receiving it hasn't protected themselves. I set the document down on the table, flat. I smoothed it with my hand once, the way you smooth a surface before you build something on it. And then I said, very calmly, very clearly, "I want you to wait here for a moment." I stood up, walked down the hall, and knocked on the door of the room I needed to go to. Because the answer to this demand wasn't mine alone to give. And what was about to happen in that kitchen, what was about to walk back down that hallway on steady, dignified feet, was something Claire had not factored into her research at all. Rosie walked into that kitchen under her own power. I want that to be understood clearly. Not shuffling, not leaning on me, not fragile. She walked in with the kind of unhurried certainty that comes from a woman who has lived long enough to not be rushed by anything or anyone. She was dressed properly, her white hair pinned back, wearing the cardigan she saved for occasions she considered serious. When she appeared in the doorway, the temperature in that room changed. Claire's expression shifted in a way she couldn't control, something between guilt and genuine shock, because the last time she had seen Rosie, this woman had been fading, and what she was seeing now was the opposite of that. Rosie sat down at the table without being invited, which was both intentional and entirely her right. She looked at the legal document in the center of the table for a moment, didn't touch it yet, just looked at it. And then she looked at Claire with the kind of directness that only very old and very clear-minded people have. "You look tired," she said to Claire, not as a greeting, as a diagnosis. Claire opened her mouth and said, "Grandma, And Rosie held up one hand, just slightly, and Claire stopped. "I don't know if I've ever seen anything more quietly powerful in my life." Rosie reached across the table and picked up the legal document. She didn't read it slowly the way I had. She flipped through it with the speed of someone who had dealt with enough paperwork in her life to know what it said before it said it. Then she looked at Claire again and said, "You want the land?" Not a question. Claire nodded carefully and began to say something about it being complicated, about family, about what was fair. And Rosie said, "I remember this exactly. Fair was 5 years ago. You made your choice then." And she tore the document in half, not dramatically, efficiently, like removing something that had no business being in her kitchen. Claire's face went through several things at once. Shock, humiliation, a flash of anger she had enough sense to contain, and then something that looked, underneath all of it, like the first honest emotion she'd felt since arriving. Grady stood up from his chair instinctively, which accomplished nothing except confirming that he had no authority in this situation whatsoever. Rosie explained, in a voice that was measured and matter-of-fact, that the land had been placed in a trust, that it was not available for sale, negotiation, or challenge, that the structure had been designed specifically to prevent exactly this kind of approach, and that no amount of legal language about shared family legacy would change what was documented in Sacramento. What I remember most is the silence after Rosie finished speaking. It was the kind of silence that tells you something is permanently over, not a pause, not a hesitation, but a close. Grady looked at Claire. Claire looked at her hands. And Rosie looked at me. In that look was everything: the 5 years of work, the recovery of this land, the dignity we had rebuilt together, the family we had made of just the two of us while the rest of the family played their games in their comfortable houses. Rosie had been handed to me as a burden. She had turned out to be the most powerful person in that room. I think she had always known it. She was just waiting for the right moment to remind everyone else. I called security calmly. I want to be honest about how that felt. There was no drama in my voice, no raised pulse that I was aware of, no performance. I picked up my phone and asked the property manager to come to the main house. Claire watched me do it, and I could see her recalibrating, still searching for an angle, some last appeal to something I hadn't thought of yet. "Alice, please. You don't have to do this," she said, and her voice broke just slightly. Real or performed, I genuinely couldn't tell and had stopped trying to determine. I told her I wasn't doing anything to her. I was simply managing what happened on my property. 2 of the farm's senior staff arrived within a few minutes. These were people I trusted, people who had worked this land with me, people who understood without being told what was happening and what I needed. They stood at the edge of the room with that particular quiet authority of those who are exactly where they belong. Grady picked up his folder from the table, though Rosie had torn the central document. There were still other pages, and said nothing. Claire looked at me one last time with an expression I've thought about many times since, trying to name it accurately. I think it was the look of someone realizing, for the first time, that they had fundamentally miscalculated who I was. I walked them to the door, not because I had to, they knew where the door was, but because I wanted to. I wanted to close it myself, behind them, deliberately. As we moved through the house, I watched Claire look at the photographs on the wall, the evidence of a life built with real love and real labor. She looked at a photo of Rosie and me at the first farmer's market, holding up our produce in an overlit December morning. She paused at it for a fraction of a second and then kept walking. I don't know what she felt in that fraction of a second. I know what I felt. Nothing I needed to apologize for. They got into the rental car and drove down the main road toward the gate. I stood on the porch and watched. The gate closed behind them with a sound I felt all the way through my chest. For the first time, a boundary in my life worked exactly the way it was supposed to. This place, which had once represented rejection and abandonment, had become something so completely its own that the people who had tried to define it as worthless could no longer enter it without being let in. Rosie came to stand beside me on the porch. We watched the car disappear down the road. After a long moment, she said, "That's that then." I said, "That's that." And we went back inside. We had dinner to make, a harvest to plan for the following week, and 2 women's lives to continue living in dignity. The gate being closed was not the end of anything important. It was confirmation of something that had already been true for a long time, that the family we needed, we had already built. Everything else was just paperwork, and not even good paperwork as it turned out. The foreclosure on the Portland estate was finalized 7 weeks after Claire and Grady left the farm. I didn't find out immediately. I found out when the same contact who had kept me loosely informed over the years sent a brief message with a property listing attached. The brick house on the hill, the house Claire had claimed in that lawyer's office while the funeral flowers were still fresh, was being sold at a distressed price through a lender. I looked at the listing for about 30 seconds and then closed it. Not because I was indifferent, I wasn't, but because I had no useful response to it. It was simply a consequence arriving at the speed consequences arrive when you spend years building on nothing solid. The bankruptcy filing came soon after. It was public record, so there was no secret to it. Claire's financial position had deteriorated past the point of private management and crossed into legal documentation. Everything she had taken from our parents' estate, everything she had consumed over 5 years of lifestyle maintenance and debt accumulation, was now the subject of proceedings that listed her assets and her liabilities in cold, numerical terms. Numbers are honest in a way that people aren't always. The years of spending against an inheritance she'd treated as infinite. It was right there in the filing for anyone who looked. Grady left. I heard this last and it surprised me least. He had been the man standing next to the money, present when the resources existed and apparently elsewhere when they didn't. His departure was its own kind of verdict on the choices Claire had made, on the version of herself she had constructed, and that couldn't sustain itself without the material foundation she had wasted. I didn't feel satisfaction about his leaving the way I might have 5 years earlier. What I felt was the tired recognition that this is simply what happens when the only things holding a life together are things you've taken rather than built. The shaming of it, public foreclosure, public bankruptcy, the loss of the life she had arranged for herself with such confidence in that attorney's office. I thought about what that must feel like. I thought about it honestly, without suppressing the human acknowledgement that watching someone who humiliated you face consequences is not a straightforward emotion. I had been backstabbed and discarded, and now the pattern of her choices had made her outcomes almost inevitable. She had consumed everything and built nothing. That story always ends the same way. 5 months after Claire left the farm, the call finally came. The same voice that had handed me a broken deed and a sick grandmother and said, "Take this." I don't need it would eventually be reduced to calling me with nothing left. I didn't know what I would feel when that happened. But somewhere in the back of my mind, in the part that remembered every moment of what she had taken from me, every humiliation, every month of hard work in the dark, I already knew that when that call came, I would be ready. And that my answer would be the last answer I would ever have to give her. The call came on a Tuesday evening in October, when I was sitting on the porch watching the harvest crew wrap up for the day in the east field. My phone showed a number I'd never saved but recognized. I looked at it ring for a moment. Rosie was inside making tea. The fields were golden in the late afternoon light. Everything around me was the product of years of work and refusal to disappear. I picked up. Alice. She said my name the same way she had in the driveway 5 months earlier, testing whether it would land. This time I said, Claire. What followed was several minutes of crying. Real crying. Not the performed emotion of someone managing an audience, but the ugly, genuine kind that comes from a person who has run out of options and is no longer able to maintain the construction she's built around herself. She talked about the house. She talked about the bankruptcy. She talked about Grady leaving, about the financial situation being worse than she'd let on to anyone, about needing help, just temporary help, just to get through this. She used the word family 5 or 6 times. She used the phrase, I'm your sister, at least twice. She was crying through all of it, real tears, real desperation. I listened to all of it. I want to be clear about that. I did not cut her off. I did not perform coldness for its own sake. I did not pretend I couldn't hear what she was saying. I let her finish. And when the silence came, when she had said everything she had called to say, I took a breath and I spoke. I told her, calmly, without cruelty, without raising my voice, without satisfaction, that the sister she was looking for had ceased to exist 5 years ago in a lawyer's office in Portland. That the Alice who had been handed a deed and a sick grandmother and sent away without a fair inheritance was gone. That the person she was calling for help had been left behind in that office and had never recovered. And that I wished her well, genuinely, but that I couldn't give her what she was asking for. She asked me why. She said she understood she'd made mistakes, but wasn't I going to show her mercy? Wasn't I going to be the bigger person? The bigger person. I had spent 5 years being the bigger person in the most literal sense. I had taken the smallest thing and made it the biggest thing, and I had done it while caring for someone her greed had abandoned. I had been bigger in every way that mattered. Being the bigger person doesn't mean extending your neck to the same blade twice. I told her that too, in fewer words. Then I said goodbye. I hung up. I blocked the number. And I sat on the porch in the October light and felt the quietest kind of peace I have ever felt. Rosie called me in for tea a few minutes later. I went inside. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where legal documents had been torn and family had been expelled, and drank tea in the kind of silence that's the opposite of emptiness. It's fullness that doesn't need words. Outside, the harvest crew was loading the last of the day's product into cold storage. The brand we had built together was alive and growing and protected. And the call I had just ended was truly the last time that chapter of my life would reach for me. I had hung up. I had blocked the number. And I had never, not once, not for a moment, looked back. There's a particular kind of mourning on a working farm that I don't think you can understand until you've earned it. When the air is cool and the fields are ordered, and you've already been awake for an hour before anyone else, and you're walking the rows just to look at what you're responsible for. Not proudly, not arrogantly, but with the quiet accountability of someone who knows the work is real, and the land is real, and everything you see is the direct result of choices you made when easier choices were available. That's my life now. That is what was built out of betrayal, injustice, and a piece of land my sister handed me like an insult. Rosie as well. I want to say that clearly and completely, because so much of this story is also her story, her reclamation, her restoration, her refusal to simply fade out the way people expected her to. She tends a small personal garden on the south side of the farmhouse. She has strong opinions about the herb drying process that she shares loudly and is usually right about. She has a rhythm, a purpose, a community in the workers who visit the house, and in the small farm dinners we host seasonally for our restaurant partners. She matters here in every sense of the word, and the woman who tried to hand her off as a burden is now bankrupt and alone, which is not something I celebrate, but which I acknowledge as the kind of outcome that tends to follow the kind of choices that were made. What I've come to understand, in the years since all of this happened, is something that the language of revenge and vengeance and payback only partially captures. It's not just that the karma came back around. It's not just that justice was served in some poetic, cosmic way. It's that the entire arc of this story is really about the question of what is family. Blood is biology. Family is behavior. The woman who had every biological claim on my life, but who had been treated as if she had none, became my true family in the deepest sense of the word, through 5 years of shared work, shared meals, shared mornings, shared purpose. That's the real story. That's the thing I want you to walk away with. Reclaiming your life after a betrayal of this magnitude is not a single dramatic moment. It is not the gate closing or the document being torn, or the phone call being ended. It is every morning you chose to work instead of collapse. Every decision to protect instead of surrender. Every hour you spent building something real instead of mourning something stolen. Self-worth is not recovered in a confrontation. It's rebuilt in quiet, sustained, daily refusal to accept the diminished version of yourself that someone else tried to impose on you. That is what this farm is. That is what every acre of it represents. I will never forgive my sister in the way that word is usually used. As a release, a reconciliation, a restoration of relationship. Some things are not built to be forgiven. They are built to be survived, learned from, and permanently closed. The boundary I drew is not an act of bitterness. It is an act of clarity. And clarity, the clear-eyed, documented, legally protected, harvest-producing clarity of exactly what I built and who I am, is the most powerful form of justice I know. The story doesn't end with her punishment. It ends with my peace. And peace, as it turns out, is the greatest revenge of all. So let me ask you something. And I want you to sit with this question honestly. Have you ever had someone in your life hand you what they thought was your worst-case scenario, only for it to turn out to be the exact foundation you needed to build your best one? Because that's what happened here. That's the part of this story that doesn't fit in the neat categories of betrayal and revenge and karma. The real twist, the one that still gets me, is that my sister thought she was punishing me, and she was actually freeing me. I want to know what you thought while you watched this story unfold. Did you see yourself in Alice? Did someone in your life once hand you their version of a shabby house, a dead-end job, a broken relationship, an inheritance of hardship that was really a disguised opportunity? Leave it in the comments below, because the most powerful stories in this space aren't just the ones we tell, they're the ones you recognize as your own. Have you ever been the one who was underestimated? Have you ever had to decide between bitterness and building? What did you choose? And what about the ending? The phone call, the blocked number, the final boundary? Was that justice to you? Or do you think forgiveness would have been the stronger move? I genuinely want to know where you land on that, because this is a conversation worth having. Drop your honest reaction below. Disagree with me if you need to. This is a space for real reflection. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think about someone in your life, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because every single week, we come back here and we dig into the stories that most people are too afraid to tell out loud. The betrayals that changed everything, the boundaries that saved everything, and the quiet, unseen work of people who were written off and refused to stay written off. You don't want to miss what's coming next. The next story is already going to hit differently, and you'll want to be here when it does. Here is a summary of every correction applied. Critical fixes. Claire was removed completely, replaced with simply Claire. The legal inheritance scene was rewritten so Claire is established as already designated successor trustee, acting with prepared documents, making the speed credible. Rosie's trust description was upgraded from honorary trustee to lifetime beneficiary and legacy steward, and a sentence was added showing Marcus explained the full trust to both women at the kitchen table, which grounds Rosie's authority in the confrontation scene. The biological contradiction was corrected. The woman who had no biological claim became the woman who had every biological claim on my life but had been treated as if she had none. The confused speculation about the parents having a secret plan was replaced with a clean, stronger line. Alice stops trying to make her parents noble and accepts they simply failed. The infidelity of assumptions construction was replaced throughout with arrogance of assumptions and betrayal embedded in. The satisfaction of architecture line was replaced with a more grounded, natural image of the gate closing. A light chronological anchor, 5 months after Claire left the farm, the call finally came, was added to the karma section. Claire was given one early character-establishing line about always being the organized, decisive one, making her takeover feel inevitable rather than sudden. Grady's passive opportunist role was tightened for consistency. Several repeated thematic statements across transition blocks were trimmed to reduce redundancy without removing any paragraphs or lines.